My name is Sarah, and for 20 years, I'd held on to a phantom limb of a family. Not a family in the warm, comforting sense, but a collection of individuals bound by blood and an unspoken agreement to avoid each other. My father, Robert, was the glue that barely held us together, a quiet man who built a successful construction business from nothing. He was the kind of man who'd rather fix a leaky faucet than talk about feelings. And that, I now realize, was our undoing. When the call came that he'd collapsed, I felt a strange mix of dread and nothing. Just a hollow ache where familial love should have been. He was gone within hours, and with him the last fragile thread connecting me to my two brothers, Mark and David. Mark, the eldest, always the golden child, charismatic and charming on the surface, but with an underlying current of manipulation I'd always felt, even as a kid. And David, the youngest, the free spirit, who'd vanished after a particularly explosive argument with Dad 10 years ago, only to reappear now like a ghost summoned by the scent of inheritance. The funeral was a blur of polite condolences and averted gazes. We stood, three strangers in black, united only by a shared last name and a deceased patriarch. It was after the final eulogy when the lawyer, Mr. Henderson, cleared his throat and announced, "Robert never actually finalized his will," that the real drama began. A collective gasp rippled through the small gathering. No will? My father, the meticulous planner, the man who diagrammed every plumbing pipe and electrical wire in his blueprints, had left behind a void where his last wishes should have been. Panic, raw and unadulterated, seized me. My father's estate wasn't just a few trinkets. It was a multi-million-dollar construction empire built brick by painstaking brick. Without a will, state law dictated everything would be divided equally amongst his three children. Fair, right? Not when you consider 2 decades of silent resentment, unspoken betrayals, and a deep-seated chasm of misunderstanding. Mark was the first to speak, his voice smooth, practiced. "Well, this is unexpected, but I'm sure we can work this out, right? We're family." The word family felt like a curse on his lips. I knew his game. He'd always played the peacemaker, the responsible one, while subtly undermining everyone around him. And David, he just looked shell-shocked, probably still processing the idea that Dad was truly gone, let alone the sudden influx of potential wealth. We agreed, reluctantly, to meet at Mr. Henderson's office the following week. The old office building, smelling of stale coffee and ancient paper, felt like a pressure cooker. Mark arrived impeccably dressed, a polished veneer of professionalism. David, predictably, was late, looking like he'd slept in his clothes, his eyes still holding that lost boy look. And me, I just felt a growing sense of dread, a knot tightening in my stomach. This wasn't about money for me, not really. It was about finally confronting the ghosts of our past. Mr. Henderson laid out the facts. Without a will, the business, the properties, the substantial bank accounts, everything was to be split 3 ways. Mark immediately pounced. "Look, I've been involved in the business for years. Dad taught me everything. It makes sense for me to take over, run things. We can just buy Sarah and David out." His voice was reasonable, almost comforting, but the underlying possessiveness was chilling. I bristled. "Buy us out? Mark, Dad built that business from nothing. It's not just a collection of assets, it's his legacy. And what about David? He walked away, yes, but he's still Dad's son." David, to my surprise, finally spoke, his voice raspy. "I don't want the business, Mark. I don't know what I want. Just not more fighting." That was the spark. Mark's eyes narrowed. Fighting? David, you've been absent for a decade. You think you just get to waltz back in and claim a piece of what I helped build? That meeting spiraled. Accusations flew. Mark brought up David's past failures, his irresponsibility. David, surprisingly, fired back, accusing Mark of always being Dad's favorite, of pushing him out. And me? I found myself playing peacemaker, a role I despised, trying to remind them of Dad's wishes, the unsaid ones, the ones that lived in the memories of his actions, not his words. The lawyer, a man accustomed to contentious situations, suggested mediation. We agreed, if only to escape the suffocating tension of that room. The mediator was a kind, silver-haired woman named Eleanor. She tried to guide us, to find common ground, but it was like trying to irrigate a desert with a thimble. Mark was always prepared. He'd bring spreadsheets, projections, legal documents, all subtly designed to prove his indispensable value to the company and, by extension, his deservingness of the lion's share. He argued that selling the business would decimate its value, that he was the only one capable of running it, safeguarding Dad's legacy. He even had a buyer lined up for David's and my shares, a ridiculously low offer, of course. David, meanwhile, was a wild card. He'd show up late, sometimes not at all. When he was there, he'd either be silent, withdrawn, or burst out with seemingly irrational demands, fueled by years of pent-up anger. He wanted Dad's old fishing boat, a specific antique clock, things that held sentimental value to him, but seemingly little monetary worth. Mark would scoff, dismissive of these childish whims. I started doing my own digging. I wasn't just Sarah, the forgotten middle child anymore. I was Dad's daughter, and I felt a responsibility to understand his true wishes. I went through his old ledgers, his personal effects. I found old photographs, letters from his early business days. It was tedious, but a nagging feeling in my gut told me there was something more. One evening, while sifting through a dusty box in his study, I found it. Tucked beneath old blueprints for his first major project was a small leather-bound journal. It wasn't a diary, not exactly. It was more like a logbook of his thoughts, his frustrations, his hopes. And in it, he'd occasionally written about us, his children. The entries about Mark were complex. Dad admired his ambition, his business acumen, but there was an underlying note of worry. Mark is too focused on the bottom line, he'd written. He forgets the people who build it. And then, something that chilled me. He pressured me to cut corners on the Peterson project, said no one would know. I refused. Reputation is everything. My blood ran cold. The Peterson project was a major turning point for Dad's business, establishing his reputation for integrity. Mark had tried to compromise that. This wasn't just sibling rivalry. This was a fundamental difference in values. But it was the entries about David that truly broke my heart. Dad had always seemed so distant from him, so critical. But in the journal, there were flashes of a father's longing. David has a good heart, a free spirit. He just needs to find his path. I wish I knew how to help him. And then a more recent entry, just a few months before he died. David came by. We talked for hours. He's hurting. I think I misjudged him. I regret so much. I knew then what I had to do. This wasn't just about the money. It was about Dad's true legacy, about setting the record straight, and perhaps about healing something that had been broken for far too long. I called an emergency meeting with Mr. Henderson, Mark, and David. I brought the journal. Mark scoffed when I produced it. "Sarah, what is this? Some old diary? This isn't legal documentation." "No, I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. It's something far more important. It's Dad's voice, his unwritten will. I started reading slowly, deliberately, from the entries about Mark, about the Peterson project, the pressure he'd put on Dad. Mark's face, usually so composed, started to crack. His jaw tightened, his eyes darted nervously. Then, I turned to David. I read the entries about his good heart, about Dad's regrets, his longing to connect. David, who had been so withdrawn, slowly lifted his head. His eyes, usually so distant, were wide, glistening with unshed tears. He looked at me, then at the journal, then at Mark, a raw vulnerability exposed. The room was silent, save for the soft rustle of the journal pages. Mark, cornered, finally erupted. He started shouting, denying everything, accusing me of fabricating stories, of trying to manipulate the situation. But his words lacked conviction. His usual charm had evaporated, replaced by raw panic. "You always do this, Sarah," he yelled, his voice cracking. "Always trying to expose people, always trying to make things difficult." "No, Mark," I said, my voice calm, resolute. "I'm trying to make things right. Dad cared about integrity. He cared about his family, even when he struggled to show it. He didn't want his business, his life's work, to be handled by someone who would compromise his values." Mr. Henderson, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. "Mark, while this journal isn't legally binding in the typical sense, it certainly paints a picture of your father's intentions and concerns. In a probate court, this could absolutely be introduced as evidence of his wishes, especially regarding the long-term management of the company. The threat of legal action, of his carefully constructed image being dismantled in open court, was enough to deflate Mark. He slumped back in his chair, defeated. What happened next surprised us all. David, still looking vulnerable, but with a newfound strength in his voice, spoke. "I don't want any part of the business, Mark, and I don't want your buyout, but I want Dad's fishing boat, and I want that antique clock, and I want to know why you did what you did." His gaze was fixed on Mark, not accusatory, but searching. Mark, surprisingly, didn't respond with anger. He just sighed, a long, weary sigh. "Because I always felt like I had to prove myself, had to be better, stronger, more successful than both of you. And Dad, he always kept me at arm's length, even when I did everything right." It wasn't an excuse, but it was an explanation, raw and unpolished. That was the turning point. Not a full reconciliation, not yet, but an acknowledgement. In the end, we reached an agreement. I would take over the business. It was a daunting prospect, but after reading Dad's journal, I felt a responsibility to uphold his legacy, his integrity. I had helped him with accounting in the past, knew the basics, and with Mr. Henderson's guidance, I was confident I could learn. Mark, his reputation now on the line, agreed to sell his shares back to the company at a fair but not exorbitant price. He would move on, pursue other ventures, no longer tied to Dad's shadow. And David? He got his fishing boat and the antique clock. More importantly, he got a piece of his father's understanding, a validation that he hadn't been forgotten even when he was far away. It wasn't a Hollywood ending. We didn't suddenly become a picture-perfect family. Mark and I still have a cautious relationship, built on respect rather than affection. David and I, however, have started to truly connect. We talk, we share memories of Dad, we even go fishing sometimes. The fishing boat, that symbol of a lost connection, has become a bridge. My father's unwritten will wasn't about money or property. It was about truth, about understanding, and about finding closure. It taught me that sometimes the most profound legacies are not in what's written down, but in the echoes of a life lived, the lessons learned, and the difficult conversations finally had. And sometimes, in the most unexpected places, you find the real story, the one that truly matters.